Dmitry Bykov is a man of many talents, a poet, journalist, essayist and novelist. He visited London this week to give a spoken word performance to London's Russian community, and we invited him into our studio. I'm Alice Lagnado, and with me in the studio are Polina, Boiko and Dmitry Linnik. Dmitry, you're a novelist, poet, journalist and political activist. What's the most important to you out of these four?
Well, first of all, I hope not to be a political activist, because that's a kind of social duty, but that's not my profession. As we say in Russia, a good person is not a profession. It's more respectable in Russian tradition to consider yourself a poet, even if you can, if you can write two rhymed verse, two rhymed lines, you consider to be a poet, because a poet is a national pride and maybe a national sport. Then I'd like to be a journalist because it's dangerous. And sometimes, for example, when you get acquainted with a new girl and you say that you're a journalist, so that's a kind of, you're a knight. So you are just the defender of freedom, for example. You are an interesting person who is aware of everything, practically. So journalist is also very honorable. Prosaist is a loser, surely. It's a lousy person. Writer is a very shameful thing. And for example, when I was serving in the Soviet army, I was called writer because I was writing something all the time. Nobody likes writers, so I prefer to call myself poet.
Well, actually, that's something I wanted to pick up on. You've said that writers and certainly poets are a dirty race and that you prefer to call yourself a journalist. In Britain, it's much more respectable to be a writer than a journalist. Why do you see things differently?
Well, you see, that was Mandelstam's expression for the so-called fourth prose. Writers are the dirty race, with dirty ways of cooking and so on. That Mandelstam should be quoted very exactly. I don't remember it by heart. He called writers the dirty race because that was the race of traders who always are trading their friends, who are selling to the power, who are ready to, as he said, all writers are sold to the devil who was Stalin in his mind. I think that writer generally is a person who doesn't participate in life. He's just looking at it. He tries to be safe. Sometimes he really serves to power because he depends on it. I think that poet is somebody who depends only on God. And writer, generally, he's a person who depends from editor. And so I should say that poet is honorable, journalist is hero also, because he also defends human rights and so on. Writer is something really lousy. And so I prefer to call myself a poet and journalist.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the project that you're here in London with, Гражданин Поэт, and
it's Citizen Poet.
Citizen Poet, I'm sorry. And for just over a year, you've written and released regularly these political satires, little poems, and they're read by the acclaimed Russian actor Mikhail Yefremov. The whole project started out really small and it's snowballed. How did it come about? And did you ever imagine that it would get this big?
Well, it was a surprise for us, sure. But I won't agree that there is any fame of the project. The project is famous in very narrow circles and very locally. Only maybe a very small percent of Russian population is really interested in what happens.
But the YouTube channel has 13 million hits.
13 millions, just 13 millions for 52 issues, it's not too much. Our best result was about 500,000 for one. I should say maybe that's normal because good poet and good actor, I hope so, try to express something that is felt by anybody but can't be told by different reasons. Many people are afraid to think, not because they are afraid of some social circumstances. They are afraid to tell the truth to themselves because this truth will demand something from them. I think that these poems were not too witty or not too dangerous, but they were expressing the thoughts and hopes and ideas which were common to a very big amount of people. Maybe it's not a huge percent from the population, but a huge percent from the population is thinking only about their surviving. That's normal. Maybe 10, maybe 12, maybe 15% of Russia were interested in what we are doing. And so for the year, we were writing it as a political diary. Now it's finished because Russia goes through another stage, through another period, maybe through another era, because the events are very quick now. And this new era needs new style.
If I can go back a few years, I remember watching you on television. That was at the height of the so-called Orange Revolution in the Ukraine. You and a friend went to Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. You were a guest on Ukrainian television. That was a time, I should remind for the sake of our listeners, when the Orange Revolution, as I said, was at its height, and the relations between the democratic government in Ukraine and the government in Russia were at a low ebb. I remember that the anchor on that Ukrainian television program suggested or implied that you should be on the side of the Ukrainian democratic forces, and he was, well, effectively expecting you to slam the Russian authorities for supporting undemocratic segments of the Ukrainian society, Ukrainian power structures, and you came back quite strongly in defense of Russia and its position back then. Do you still feel the same?
Well, first of all, if you are talking with a foreign journalist, you will defend your country anyway. Because, by the way, my firm principle is never to give any interviews to foreign press. I can say any dirty words about Russia and its government when I'm speaking with Russians. But I'll never say any bad word about my government when I'm speaking with foreigner. That's not a national pride, but that's maybe some habit of my pioneer childhood.
The word patriot and patriotism in Russia now are almost unmentionable in the liberal circles.
No, I think that best patriots like Ryzhkov, like Nemtsov, like Kasyanov, for example, they are in the camp of opposition. They are good patriots, surely, because they defend the more bright and maybe the more intellectual image of Russia. That's the first point. The second one is when we're speaking about Orange Revolution. By the way, I dislike Orangism as it is from this very point of the beginning of Maidan, the so-called, or when people went to the square to defend their rights. I was on the orange side, and I was in the camp of Yushchenko and Tymoshenko for a long time. I was defending their position. And by the way, when, there were two staffs, Yanukovych's and Tymoshenko's, I was, as a reporter in Tymoshenko's staff, I was reporting about it. I was visiting her. And so I was talking to her, and even now I like her much more than Yanukovych. But I think that the most strong step was to come at the square, because when you go to the square, you come away from the rules of political game to begin with. I think it's maybe that's the first step in real war, and it was war. I think Kuchma was
the previous president of the Ukraine.
The previous president, yes, who was just who was opposite the Oranges. I think it was his heroism. It was his very good and very dignity deed that he didn't do anything against the camp on Maidan. He could destroy it strictly in 2 hours, and nobody could prevent him. He didn't do it, and so now he's a kind of saint in nowadays Ukraine, because Yanukovych is much worse. By the way, Yanukovych imprisoned Tymoshenko, which was only once done by Kuchma, and only for 2 weeks. And now Tymoshenko have got, as I recall, 8 years. Just compare. I think that Orangism is very good if you struggle as a politician, and when you transfer it somehow in the genre of street battle, then I can't adopt it anyhow. And I am very proud now that Russia is avoiding this danger. I'm quite sure that Russian white revolution or snow revolution will allow Putin to get his last victory, and after it he will never be our president again.
The Orange Revolution never materialized in Russia, but the situation is somewhat similar.
Only sure.
The Orange Revolution is not camping in the Independence Square, as it did in Ukraine, but it's probably camping on the internet?
It's much more safe when it lives in internet, not in squares, first of all. Then, the main and principal difference is that Ukrainian struggle was the struggle for power. Our Russian struggle goes only for methods, only for institutions. We are struggling for true elections. True elections are not just elections where the votes are counted strictly. True elections are, for example, the elections where all the participants are allowed to participate, when people who really represent nowadays political Russia can try the race. Now they're just away from the political square. They don't participate at all. So I'm quite sure that struggle for institutions, which goes into the internet, is much more perspective and self-respectable, I should say, than the street struggle for any concrete politician.
Do you see your role in the League of Voters, the civic movement for free and fair elections? Is it an important role for you? You didn't mention it in your list of professions.
Well, there are only very few writers which I really like. It's very pleasant to be in one organization with Akunin, Parfenov, journalist and writer, and Dulitskaya. That's the main reason I participate in the League of Electors. I am quite sure that this organization could be sometimes maybe just the beginning of political party. Anyhow, I hope that League of Electors will help to make the so-called Svodny Protocol, I don't know how to translate it, the so-called common report, maybe the most exact translation, the common report from the elections, which is based on local letters and reports by private electors. I think that's the only aim.
I had another question about Citizen Poet. How much of it is business and how much of it is politics? Is it business?
Well, I think it's not a huge profit because that some of our critics and enemies in Russia say that now opposition becomes a good business. I'd like them to try this business because this business includes many risks. You are practically separated from your real profession. You are not invited on TV, for example. You get very special phone calls with the questions, for example, when are you going to die and so on. Sure, our concerts are popular enough. Then, sometimes after the concerts, I get much more because the concerts, for example, gather 5,000 or 6,000 people, for example, like it was in Kiev. And our farewell concert in Moscow, it seems so interesting to the spectators that we should repeat it in a week. We were planning to bury a project on 5th of March. Now we'll dig it up and then to dig it away on 11th.
Does that affect the symbolism of
yes, there is some symbolism, because in Russia you never can bury something from one time. Stalin is buried for 50 years and nothing happens. So the sums are good. The risks are even better. So I can say that maybe we are paid like a not very popular rock singer just beginning his career.
Just a reminder, this is Alice Lagnado at the Voice of Russia in London. I'm joined by Polina, Boiko and Dmitry Linnik, and we're talking to Dmitry Bykov.